Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our online talk with Miguel A. Aragon, co-hosted by Manhattan Graphic Center and the Print Center, Philadelphia. MGC's events are made possible by grants from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, New York State Council on the Arts, the Pierre and Tana Matisse Foundation, and many individual and private foundations and individual supporters. I would also like to acknowledge the Print Center sponsors for their support, the Philadelphia Cultural Fund, the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, the William Penn Foundation, as well as the Print Center's many other individual and foundation supporters. Thank you. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Miguel A. Aragon to speak about his work, which explores subjects of violence, memory, perception, and the multiple. He uses erasure as a language through processes that are reductive in nature. Aragon lives and works in New York City, where he is an assistant professor in printmaking at CUNY College of Staten Island. Aragon studied at the University of Texas at El Paso and the University of Texas at Austin. He has exhibited extensively nationally and internationally through solo and group exhibitions and has received numerous awards, prizes, and residencies. His work has also been included in several contemporary surveys of printmaking and is included in various private and public collections, such as the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and the National Museum of Mexican Art in Chicago, among others. After his presentation, Aragon will speak with Senia Nuril, the Jensen Bryan curator at the Print Center in Philadelphia, where she curated an exhibition of his work earlier this year titled Miguel A. Aragon, Indices of Silence, Indices del Silencio. Dr. Nuril is an art historian, curator, and writer specializing in global, modern, and contemporary art. In addition to her work at the Print Center, she has organized exhibitions at the Zimmerli Art Museum, the Bruce Museum, Lower East Side Print Shop, and MoMA. Dr. Nuril lectures widely and frequently writes for international exhibition catalogs, magazines, and academic journals. Dr. Nuril holds a BA in Art History and Slavic Studies from New York University and an MA and PhD in Art History from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. I'm just going to give you a few notes about tonight's event. We've disabled chat for this event so that you can allow full enjoyment of the images on your screen and our panelists and speakers. Please type any questions you have for the artist or Dr. Nuril in the Q&A function, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. We will answer questions about certain details of the work during the talk itself or in a typed response. General or philosophical questions will be addressed at the end and presented by Elizabeth Spangin, the Executive Director of the Print Center. And now please welcome Miguel A. Aragon.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. And thank you everybody at the Manhattan Graphic Center and the Print Center for hosting this joint venture for my artist talk. It's really an honor to be in relationship with both institutions. So I'm going to share my screen now so that you all can see my presentation. And whoops, I just want to confirm that it's on now, correct? So this first image is just to show you, or to give you an idea or a sense of where I grew up and where my work was primarily developed. So I was born and raised in Juarez, Mexico, which is a border town with El Paso, Texas. They're sister cities. And, really going from one country to the next is as easy as just crossing the border point, which, would take 5 minutes if there were no traffic, either pedestrian or cars. This is the city that I grew up in and what has influenced most of my body of work throughout my career. And so what I want to talk about is give a little bit of a background of where my work is coming from. In 2006, the president at the time in Mexico decided to declare an official war on drugs And this affected the city quite a lot because being a border town, Ciudad Juarez was an area that was very much treasured by the cartels, so that would be able to cross narcotics into the United States. And so basically from almost one overnight, the city changed completely because the violence spiked up almost immediately. And the president unfortunately had to send out garrisons of federal police and even military, at the time. So, this is sort of a background that I want you to understand so that there's a better understanding for my work. This is the first series that I created back in late 2000s, and is based on a photograph that I saw on the local newspaper in Juarez. I was still living out there at the time. And this image follows this, this sequence, and then eventually you get to see what it is that is representing, or what it is that it's trying to capture. And so this particular photograph is something that really sparked my interest in trying to pursue this body of work even further. Before I move on into my work, I do want to explain my process a little bit, because my work is very much tied with the way that I create the pieces. So for this particular series, I use a laser engraver to be able to burn cardboard matrices to be able to create a layer of soot that then I would transfer onto paper. This is, sort of a traditional printing technique, the way that I transfer the soot. So this images on the top is the matrix itself after the machinist has done it or prepared it for me, and then on the bottom is this. It's a similar plate that I ended up hand picking up some of the pieces to be able to process the plate even further to be able to make the images. Now for the previous series that I showed are the only ones that are figurative. When I ended up developing this particular technique, I was starting to look at different images that I'm going to show you one for just a couple of seconds to get a sense of what it is that the citizens in Juarez were experiencing on a daily basis during that time. So this is an image that captures basically what the city at the time was experiencing on a daily basis. And not only on a daily basis, but actually even multiple times daily. And so using these photographs that were coming from forensic images, but also captured by the medium, is what I started to using as the basis for my work. And the reason for this is because I wanted to see, or I wanted to explore how these images become memories or become traumatic events that we want to erase from our consciousness. By we, I mean people who were living in the city at the time and still are. And so this particular technique allowed me to be able to fracture these images. They are, as you saw, very crude and raw, and therefore those people or viewers wouldn't want to spend a lot of time looking at those images. And so my approach was to fragment those images to be able to speak about memory and trauma this way. So the correlations between the subject matter and the process is something that I place particular attention into my work to be able to create this body of work. And so I have to mention that these pieces, when they're seen in person, are much more abstract. They're not as representative as they might be right now. And that's because when they become digital, a lot of the subtle details are actually lost. So for example, these pieces have a lot of depth within the pieces. They're physical in that they have embossments within the pieces. And so that affects how the reader is viewing them when they're being seen in person. As you can see, there's also variation of tones. And those are, connections that I allude as far as how much those original images that people were experiencing at the time in the city were being, in a sense, engraved into our consciousness, and how when we try to erase those bad memories, in a sense, they're never going to really disappear completely from our consciousness, but rather there's always going to be something that's going to be lingering. And eventually there might be triggers that will bring back some of those memories, but they will never come back in its true original form, but rather in a more abstract way, such as these images that I'm creating. Now, I should also mention that I've actually been following the violence in the city since the mid-90s. This is something that the city has always been utilized by cartels to transport drugs into the United States. Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, Texas is one of the bigger border towns between the two countries. And so because of that, it's obviously very much allured, for the cartels to use it to be able to transport narcotics. And so back in the mid to late 1990s, I started seeing a lot of stories and images on the local newspaper in Juarez that just kind of captivated me for some reason. I couldn't understand at the time. But what I did is I started collecting all those newspapers and those stories. And I collect them in my home and in my bedroom. And it got to a point where I had so many of them that they were just getting in my way of actually living in my own house. So this particular piece is an attempt for me to try to represent that to the viewer, this kind of burden that I was putting myself by collecting these images and these stories. And to be able to do this, I wanted to transfer it, in a physical way. So I created this cast mold, or this mold that I would then cast one of these bundles of newspapers, so that, to give a sense that these stories are heavy in nature. I mean, just by seeing the physicality of these pieces, I feel that the viewer would be able to understand what it was that I was feeling mentally, just by knowing that these stacks of papers in my bedroom actually represented all these stories that were speaking about people being missing or being killed in the city. One thing that I did with this exhibition space was to actually encourage the viewers to pick up the newspapers so that they could read those stories and they could see those images, and also to take them home if they wanted. Because for me, the idea of my work, and particularly this piece, was to inform people, not just in the city, but worldwide if possible. And so another thing that I was hoping for this particular piece was that it would be interactive with the viewers in this way. So I don't know if you notice, I actually placed newspapers in between some of those stacks of concrete cement stacks of newspaper. And the reason for this was so that people would actually have to move them around to be able to acquire the actual newspaper and be able to read those stories. And I was actually pleasantly surprised that people actually did interact with the piece, and they actually moved those stacks and felt, in a sense, the physicality of what it was that I was attempting to portray, with this particular piece. Eventually, I ended up having to let go of those newspapers, primarily because I just couldn't take them with me wherever I was moving. And so I ended up digitally scanning all of those images and saving some of those stories. And that leads me to my next bodies of work, where I ended up going back, where I always kind of go back to some of these images and reuse them for my purposes. And the reason that I do this is because I'm always seeing this as how can I approach the subject matter from a different point of view to figure out what's the better technique or the better presentation that is going to transmit my image to the public. So for this next body of work, what I did is I concentrated on portraits of casualties from the drug wars that were happening at the time. And because they're coming from newspapers, they were already pixelated. But then I also try to, once again, use erasure, in a sense, as a method to create the images. And for me, this was a way to be able to show the viewer what was happening, almost even physically to these bodies. These were being young men that were taken out of the world. And so what I was trying to do was to erase those images by transferring them, by using a chemical process and transferring them into another substrate. This idea of—
I could interrupt for a second.
Yes.
I wanted to take a minute and just really pause on these images, because the work you just showed us, the newspaper work, it's really not lost on me that you're working with another form of printmaking there. Newspapers themselves being prints and circulating throughout the world, doing exactly what you say you want your work to do. So sending a message, giving information about something happening in your case in your hometown of Juarez. And so here you're transferring that to more traditional printmaking techniques. And you mentioned the pixelation of the images. And I think later on, you also, I know from our relationship working as artist and curator on your recent exhibition, that you also use digital images, digital news images from the internet. How do you transfer from those sometimes very small pictures to these huge, larger than life? At the print center, we had pictures that were, you know, nearly floor to ceiling. So can you just talk a little bit about that jump you just made? That seems really beautiful and really indebted to kind of a longer legacy of printmaking.
Yeah, thank you, Senia. So what I did, I mean, for these particular pieces, I basically went into those photographs that were published by the newspapers, the local newspapers at the time, and I just cropped them and scanned them, you know, digitally, and then output them using just a regular printer, and be able, that's what allows me to be able to alter the size of these pieces. So these pieces that you're looking at right now, these are roughly 6 by 9 inches. So they're still relatively smaller, you know, to the next body of work that I'm going to be talking about later. And these are actually not in chronological order. I kind of go jump back and forth between the way that I'm approaching my images. Like I said, because I did collect it or digitally save all of these stories in those images, I'm able to always go back to those particular images and then see them from a different perspective or a different point of view. So like the newspaper sculpture or installation that I did, you know, that was one way of looking at the stories and presenting them to the viewer in that particular way. And then this is another way of using those similar images, or the same images actually rather, but presenting them to the viewer in a completely different way. They're cropped, they're not the same images as they were originally published, but I feel that my manipulation through the chemical process, you know, sort of talks to the idea of trying to erase, again, these events that are something that nobody wants to live with, correct? So this is just kind of my thinking as I'm working as an artist. Just how can I see a problem and look at it from different points of view to try to find the right solution if there is one. So now I'm jumping again into a different technique that I also ended up developing, where I enlarged these portraits to 38 by 50 inches, if I'm not mistaken. And so the pixelation obviously got even enhanced even further. So this allowed me to see, to be able to try to erase the image one dot at a time. So using a hand drill and different drill bits, I was able to basically erase these images. And again, I'm using the word erasure a lot, and I feel that that word connotates a negative aspect of it, but I'm actually using it more as a cleansing. Rather than trying to erase and forget something, I'm using it as trying to transform that particular image and hopefully into something more positive, which is what I'm trying to do with my work. I am always going to end up with some sort of residue or some sort of substrate by erasing that image. As you can see on the previous images or the previous body of work, even though I erase or the portraits themselves are not as legible, there is still something that lingers. And it is my hope that by seeing that abstraction of the portrait, it allows the viewer to actually humanize these people even further, rather than just concentrate on the goriness of where these images are coming from. So this particular technique that I'm showing now, I decided to create multiples of the same image. Not because I'm a printmaker, but rather because I was trained as a printmaker, or I am trained as a printmaker. I'm always thinking of the multiple. And so I created a stack of paper of different layers. This is for the first variation, which has the matrix, the original image, which is a regular large printed Xerox of the image itself. And then on the background, it has a white piece of paper that was also part of that stack and that I was drilling through. And then this is just the white paper itself as it was drilled through. And then there was also a piece of black paper also on the background. Now, all this dust that you see on this particular piece is coming from the backing that I was using for creating this body of work. And for this, I was using, or I am using drywall, primarily because it's a material that is both soft and strong. If I use any other kind of substrate, it would be either too hard for me to be able to control the drilling, especially since I'm using very small drill bits at some points. But at the same time, it's hard enough that it would, sort of hold. At least that was the idea or the intention. Interestingly enough, the paper actually held up a lot better than the drywall itself, as you can see. The drywall ended up taking all of the abuse from the process, and a couple of points, actually, it even collapsed on me before I finished making the piece, so I had to use a new piece of drywall. But I was able to document these pieces and be able to show them as well that way. Unfortunately, physically, it's more impossible to do it.
Miguel,
yes.
We have some great questions coming in, and I know that when your work was at the Print Center, it was one of the most popular questions asked. What kind of paper are you using? You just described the drywall, but could you talk a little bit about that paper? Is it anything special, or is it just from your studio? Can you let us know?
Yeah, originally, so I'm gonna go back on the images. So the black paper originally was actually tar paper, the one that is used for roofing. The idea there was that it would be a material that would be strong enough, to hold as I was drilling it. Because in all honesty, when I developed this technique, I wasn't sure that the image was actually gonna be legible to this degree of detail. I was actually expecting to have something more abstract, similar to the previous body of work. But I ended up realizing that it actually, regular paper actually works. So the white paper is actually a paper called Stonehenge. No, sorry, it's not Stonehenge. It's Lennox, and it comes in this large. It's archival paper. It's a little bit heavier on the weight, but it's still, it still becomes fragile enough, and it still holds, well enough. And as far as the matrix itself, that's just regular bond paper. I mean, I get these images printed at a local Kinko's or Staples, and I just use their large plotters, for print on this. So I can't really ask them to use a special kind of paper. So this paper is actually quite delicate and thin. And as you can see, it still holds a lot of strength within the images or through the process. So really, eventually, I ended up deciding not to use tar paper because it started becoming a problem in the way that I was storing it or moving it. So I just changed to regular Canson black paper now. So yes, so going back, these are just some installation shots of this body of work to give you a sense of, what they look like. And I was mentioning the idea of the multiple, the reason that I was creating all these multiples of the images was not necessarily so that I could have, quote unquote editions, but rather so that I could use them to transform the portrait into a different iteration of that same image. So for example, here you're seeing in an exhibition that I had in Arizona, where I used one of those extra sheets of paper that was drilled and used it as a stencil to be able to recreate the image directly on the wall. And for this piece, I used spray enamel, and specifically spray copper enamel. And the reason for this is because, again, I'm trying to tie the process with the idea. And so the color actually has a meaning. There's a saying in Mexico, or in Latin America actually, that it's the equivalent to showing your true colors, what you guys have here in the US. And so the phrase in Spanish says, "Está sacando el cobre," which if you try to translate it as literally as possible, it would say you're showing the copper. And so this is sort of, to me, using this idea that, this particular person is showing its true colors of who they are, who they were. But I do want to mention that I'm not actually I'm not making any judgment to any of these people, any of these casualties. And one thing that I also should mention is that a lot of these images are coming from people who were members of the cartels, obviously, but they were also members of the law enforcement. So policemen, soldiers, and even innocent bystanders. And I don't make the distinction in my work or in my exhibitions. I don't name the people whose images I'm using. And the reason for this is because I'm not interested in judging or having the viewer judge who these people were, because I feel that they kind of brings a lot of baggage. If they see an image and they read that it was a cartel member, they might not care as much for that particular person as if they read that it's somebody who was an innocent bystander. I think, unfortunately, a lot of these people ended up in the drug business or the drug trade business because they had no other option, either because of lack of education or because they were just they had a need for so, just for survival, to provide for their family or themselves. And so it's really not up to me or up to us to judge their decisions. What I'm interested in is in showing to the world the fact that Mexico was and is still losing generations of young men, usually between 20 and 45 years old, because those are usually the population that end up in the drug business. And it's still happening. In around 2008 to 2011, Ciudad Juarez was the most dangerous city in the world. And so that's something that affected me personally, or very much, because I was coming from this city, and I could see that I could have been one of these people if one of these person, that could have chosen this path if it were not for, my family or whatever opportunities that I had. For the most part, I concentrated on portraits because I really wanted to make the experience more into, even though I'm keeping them anonymous, I wanted to give them sort of a face in a sense. But I was able to actually create a couple of really larger pieces because I had the opportunity with a few exhibition spaces. So this is one of these larger pieces. This is 6 feet by 16 feet in total. And to be able to make these pieces, these larger pieces, I had to make them in sections. So this is just a shot of me working on one of these pieces, which is this one. And that's the largest piece I've done so far, unfortunately, because of limitations on my studio and also just not having the ability to show in much larger spaces. But this is about 8 feet by 16 feet, if I'm not mistaken, each piece, each set. Or each piece of the set. Now, I've been working with this particular technique for several years now. And as I mentioned, I'm trained as a printmaker. So from the beginning, I knew that I could have made editions or multiples out of these pieces, but that was something that never really intrigued me. I was more interested in making images or more images and be able to show this work that way rather than, have editions. However, I was approached by Flatbed Press in Austin, Texas a few years ago. And they were interested in co-publishing a few pieces of my work. So after a few discussions, we decided I could easily translate, this particular technique into a woodcut, which I had already tried in the past, but one, it was too demanding physically, and I just wasn't interested, like I said, in creating editions necessarily. So these are just images of me, transferring that particular technique, the hand drill technique that I developed, into something more traditionally printmaking, which is what most of our audience is probably interested in. So these are just, straight out woodcuts. And, for me, this was something that was sort of easy in the sense that I knew what I was going to get. I still developed the images. I had to, work with them digitally and then print them and then create the blocks and all this. But I wanted to challenge myself as an artist. So I pitched the idea of creating an intaglio piece, which I had never done with this particular technique. And, they were more than willing to experiment and to fail if necessary. So, we had those two pieces to rely on if anything went wrong with this particular piece. So this is a large sheet of copper that I ended up also drilling through to be able to create some of the highlights. And interestingly enough, copper, even though it's metal, was much softer than the MDF, which is closer to wood for me to drill. So I actually ended up liking this particular piece a lot more just because it was easier physically for me. The only part that was unfortunate for me, though, is that to be able to create different tonalities for this piece, I had to create the image. I had to create stencils for the images. And so each stencil had to be drilled individually. And so I ended up having to make 3 different layers, if I'm not mistaken, for this particular piece. So you're seeing here one of those layers, and we're applying some of the stuff out on the copper plate to be able to create the aquatine tones. And these are just process shots that I wanted to show to give you a sense of how the piece was made. So this is the final piece, and they are the same size as the original hand drill portraits. So, I wanted to keep them within the same size and style so that they would fit together as a body of work. This is still one of the main research that I'm kind of doing at this moment. And then because I did do those pieces with Flatbed, when I had an opportunity to go to Saigot, I was, I guess the traditional printmaking bug, bit me again. And so I ended up creating these pieces using again the hand drilling and creating more woodcut looking images, but again using creating stencils at the same time that I was creating the pieces to be able to create these variations of using the copper tone enamel again for the pieces. I'm gonna jump.
Miguel, could I ask a question about
Yes.
something that you just mentioned a couple times, traditional printmaking, right? You're trained as a printmaker.
Mm-hmm.
You just cited the difference between, let's say, my work and traditional printmaking or the hand-drilled work and traditional printmaking. And so could you just, I don't know, can you just talk about a little that distinction, how you kind of come to that distinction, what role experimentation might play in that distinction? And also, I mean, out of curiosity, like, what brought you to the hand drill, right? I mean, I can read a few things into that, but what was that moment when you were like, okay, today I'm finally going to make a work with hand drill versus, you know, whatever you would have used while you were studying printmaking all those years?
Yes. So I'm very process oriented within my artwork. And so printmaking was a natural fit for me. But at the same time, even though I do love some of the traditional techniques, you know, I feel that the technique itself has to complement the subject matter. So you know, you can't just do, in my perspective, you can't just do a drawing for a drawing's sake or a painting for a painting's sake. I feel that there has to be more connections or deeper connections between the subject matter and the process. And this is something that I'm always, in my work, I'm always thinking. So I have ideas, and then I start to look for a process that might actually enhance those ideas. So, you know, going back to the laser engraver, you know, the laser itself is a violent process in the sense that it's burning cardboard. You know, it's making this layer of soot. And I was sort of connecting that to how the skin actually burns by gunshot wounds. It's not as visual, and we might not even think of it that way. And I know that the viewer might not even jump to those conclusions that I'm making myself, but you know, those are things that inform my work. And so with the hand drill technique, for example, it was something similar in that I started looking at all the bullet holes, you know, left behind in some of the crime scenes. And obviously they're sometimes very perfect circles, you know, created in different surfaces. And so that's what brought me into the hand drilling technique, in that I knew that using drill bits, I was going to be able to create all these different tools, I mean, those different dots. And so it's not that I was trying to become myself a surrogate, you know, as a perpetrator in a sense, you know, killing these people by making these images of corpses, but rather it was more that there are those connections between the process and the image or the subject matter. I can't deny a lot of, you know, also that the hand drill mimics a gun, but that was definitely something that I was not thinking when I developed the process. It's something that kind of came off later. But, you know, I feel that if anything, it enhanced my thinking, I hope.
Yeah, and I definitely see it as sort of like a radical revolutionizing of the labor of printmaking being within and of itself a very laborious process, whether you're working with a lithostone or a copper plate or a screen. You know, I feel that this brings that labor, gives that labor a new meaning. I mean, even you said yourself, quoting you back, is you couldn't manage to do a woodcut with the hand drill, that it was just too physically demanding for you. So I think that it's a really very innovative way to approach that process.
And that experimentation, actually, I have to credit my BFA professor, my bachelor's professor in printmaking, Kim Bauer, for always pushing his students to experiment and to try different things and to never give that curiosity of trying to come up with different ways of working. And I think that's what, you know, it was so ingrained in me that it's the way that I approach my work. I end up, you know, always coming up with multiple within my work because it's how I was trained. So now this body of work, these are actually photographs that I had a friend, Erica Botkin. I brought her with me to Juarez to document the city. So, you know, I got to a point after working with my images where, you know, I was looking at the body or the corpse, you know, far too much or far too long. And I felt that maybe I need to look at my work or this particular subject matter from a different perspective, as I keep saying. And so one thing that I noticed over time, because I still have family in Juarez, I kept going back to the city and see the changes that it went. And so these photographs intentionally at the beginning were meant to be just the basis for a body of work that I was going to create. But the more I look at the photographs, the more the photographs became the work itself. And I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. I'm hoping to everybody to see what these images are about. These are houses that I actually kind of grew up looking at because they are around where my mom used to live and when my brother still actually lives. So this is a middle class neighborhood. And, in a middle class neighborhood, you wouldn't necessarily see or expect to have this level of security. Just talk about having spikes all over your roof to be able to feel secure within your house. And unfortunately, this is what the violence did in Mexico, or in Juarez specifically, but in general, actually in all of Mexico. In that, unfortunately, we had to cope and we had to try to still pursue a fulfilling life in the city while, all this violence was happening outside our front doors, essentially. And so, this is something that it just triggered me in the sense that I just could not cope with how the city had changed. And, now I actually don't feel that Ciudad Juarez is my home anymore, because even though a lot of these houses still remain similar to how I experienced them growing up, they just don't look like they used to when I was a kid. And these photographs are capturing years of evolution of the security elements that people have added to their houses. So you can see that first they have regular fences or just garage doors, and then eventually they have to add razor wire, and then they have to do even larger fences with razor wire on top of the divisions of between the houses, to the point where they even created illegally home community or communities that were actually gated. I mean, this was not designed by the city to be a gated community, but rather this was a normal street in a neighborhood in Juarez that the several neighbors got together and decided, we're just going to close off each other. We're going to create this gated community so that we can feel protected. And the reason for this was because it got to a point where a lot of the times cartels would just do drive-by shootings where they would just approach a house and then riddle it with bullets without really knowing if anybody was going to get hit, but they were trying to, kill somebody. So this was kind of a way that citizens in Juarez were able to kind of protect themselves. Sadly enough, these have become sort of testaments of the resilience of the population. And unfortunately, now that we have to live with this, we try to shield ourselves to the ugliness of this, these elements that we had to add. But when it comes down to Christmas, for example, you have to decorate them. So you can see the Christmas lights here on the previous image. You have the Feliz Navidad or Merry Christmas, elements. And unfortunately, it's because we have to live with this violence and we have to make it the best that we can to have a purposeful life, like I said.
Miguel, I'm going to jump in. I want to make a quick observation about the previous body of work you just showed us, which is a collaboration between you and a photographer. I'm struck by the texture that those photographs evoke, and your work. I mean, should people be lucky enough to see it in person, I wish our exhibition was still on view at the Print Center. I hope you'll be exhibiting your work at venues as soon as they're deemed safe to open, because your work is so very, very special and important to see in person because of the texture that you achieve through your various processes. And I see that texture echoed here, even in these flat two-dimensional photographs, in the way you're exhibiting the layering of the barbed wire, of the walls, of the fences. And so, for me, this project, while extremely different, and when I first saw it, when you first showed it to me, I didn't quite know what to make of it, especially being a collaboration, although printmakers are so innately collaborative. I'm now actually just now listening to you speak about it. I'm so struck by how incredibly textured they are. And so I'll just give a quick warning to say that we have only a few more minutes of your formal presentation, Miguel. So preface anything that you really want to show people, and then we're going to transition. There's some great questions coming into the Q&A, and my executive director, Liz Spungen, will be moderating those. So Miguel, if you could conclude, that would be wonderful.
Yes. So I'm glad that you see that on those photographs as well, Senia, because I mean, I actually directed Erica, my friend who was helping me with these photographs. I actually told her specifically what I wanted her to capture. So it was a collaboration in that sense, but at the same time, it was, you know, me directing her in what I wanted. Again, because they were meant to be originally the starting point for something else. But the more I look at them, the more I decided these are it. And so actually I'm close to finishing here. So I just want to talk about a couple of other projects that I did recently. These were 2 screen prints that were on the exhibition, as you know. And unfortunately, these pieces don't really show a glow that is part of the piece. They're better shown in person. And I don't know why I keep making work that has to be seen in person or to be appreciated better in person. And because digital imagery doesn't do them justice. But you know, it's interesting that for me, you know, I kind of went back full circle in the sense that if you saw the first images that I showed at the beginning, you know, they were the starting point of this whole body of work that I've been researching, and they were figurative. And then I just immediately abandoned it, and it became more abstract, and the figurative, you know, slowly kind of crept in back. And so these images are again based on those original photographs that I had saved from the newspapers in Juarez, and I just went back to those images. And rather than concentrate on the casualties, meaning the corpses or the bodies, I decided this time I want to concentrate more on the forensic teams, and see if maybe there is something that looking at the subject matter from that point of view might actually enhance, you know, my message or what it is that I'm trying to do. And so another project that I'm kind of developing at the moment are these etchings, or aquatints rather, and they're based again on those same photographs, very similar to those screen prints that I was able to do in Texas State with Jeff Dell just last year. And so these are again following, you know, that same sort of figurative aspect of the work and concentrating on the forensics and also even the policemen, and erasing the body once again, but making it predominant so that it's still part of the piece itself. And my goal for these new pieces are that, you know, I want to create several of these images, and then I would be able to connect them by this line that, you know, resembles the "do not cross" police marking that they usually do for crime scenes. So I'm still, this is a sort of in progress work that I'm still thinking and developing at the moment. And that's it for my presentation. So, I mean, this is a lovely shot of our exhibition together from a few months ago. So I'm gonna stop the share now.
It's great to see that, Miguel. Brings back memories.
It sure does.
And so I think we're gonna kick off the Q&A moderated by my director, Liz Spungen.
Mm-hmm.
I am here. I don't know if you can see me.
I cannot see you.
Yeah, I can't control that. Someone else will have to do that. But if you can hear me, I will start with some of the really fabulous questions we have from our attendees. And 2 related questions. Back to that question of anonymity of the victim that you're portraying. I understand, and you explained well why you thought that was important, but our question is about how did the families feel about that, about your use of the image, and, you know, they might want a specificity when you wanted anonymity.
That is a great question. So, you know, at the beginning, I am appropriating all these images from old media. And so a lot of the times, one of the reasons that I wanted to give them a face, you know, to all these corpses is because eventually these casualties became numbers. And even though I'm still keeping them anonymous, I'm trying to give them, you know, I'm trying to be fair and humanize them. And so I was aware that, you know, some family members might actually recognize some of these people. And I was, you know, aware that, you know, it could create problems for me. But fortunately, unfortunately, at the beginning, I couldn't show my work in the city or even in Mexico, mainly because of lack of opportunities to be able to do that. Eventually, when I finally got the opportunity, I was able to actually meet not specific members of the family of some of the images that of people that I've used, but rather from just other families in general that have been affected by this violence. And they all were very supportive of me. And something that I always told myself at the beginning was that if I would hear from anybody who was affected by the violence, and they would, they would see that I would, or say that I was exploiting, this violence for my own profit, that would be the moment that I would stop making this body of work. Unfortunately, that has never happened yet. I've been able to show this work in Mexico City as well as in the border town, so and other parts of Mexico. So, it's exposed, it's out there. Several Mexican artists have seen it as well, and they all are supportive of me and what I'm doing.
In a related question, again, going back to that source material, we have a question about a copyright issue, and so the original newspaper photographer or newspaper source.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I mean, I think, my images are being abstracted enough, or I'm blanking, altered enough that I don't think it is necessarily, the copyright claim wouldn't necessarily hold up. And, again, I'm using them to shed a light to what's happening in Mexico. So I believe that I'm using them for a right cause, for a good cause. And so it's my hope that that will be seen. I am sure that, perhaps eventually somebody might disagree with me, but, I think I'm trying to do as much justice as I can to the people. And I try to alter my images as much as I can, so that not to avoid this particular problem necessarily, but rather because it's what the work demands, for my process and for what I'm trying to do with my work.
So on a different approach to your work, and one that I found so compelling while I had the privilege of living with it for several months, was the amazingly tight connection between content, process, and inspiration. And we had one question that was about your specific use of that destructive, and then you addressed it as a violent method. But in the opening, in your opening words, you also talked about engraving, which doesn't have that inherent violence in the terminology, but moving it from the printmaking term to, I think you said, engraved on the street. So if you want to, I would love to hear you just talk a little bit more about how you approach that tight connection.
Right. So, I mean, like I said, I try to look for processes that are going to inform the body of work by having connections between the subject matter and the way that I'm making the images. So, like I said, the laser engraver, it's burning the substrate, the cardboard substrate, and that is a violent event that is happening in creating the image and engraving the image and creating that layer of soot. And then I'm also, once that plate is created by the machine, I go back with an X-Acto knife and physically tear off some pieces to be able to create different layers of embossment. So those pieces are also very physical. And again, all of these levels of embossment, for me, have a direct connection to how, these events make an imprint, to make a pun, on our minds, on our memories. Some of them are deeper than others, just like the embossments on those pieces have different heights. Some of them are more subtle, some of them are more drastic. And when you see them in person, you can see physically that change. With the handrail, one thing that I was looking for was to have this weightless and fragile look to the paper. And it was one of the reasons that I was actually using paper at the beginning. And another reason that I was using also the tar paper was so that I wasn't sure whether at the beginning the paper was going to hold up. I thought the paper was going to be completely torn, and it would be more of a performative aspect of the work in that sense. But like I said, the paper is a lot stronger than we think, but it still keeps that fragility look. And one of the reasons that I don't frame those pieces when I show them, for the most part, is because I I do enjoy when people are walking around them and that first layer, you know, actually moves because of the breeze that people are creating. And that, you know, gives another aspect to the work that I think will connect with the viewer even further, because they understand what that portrait, where the portrait is coming from, and having that fragility, you know, enhanced in their experience, you know, hopefully will make them think about, you know, these people and not judge them, but rather, you know, have a cathartic moment. And that, unfortunately, this is what some people have to do to make a living.
So as a curator, I will say all curators and registrars get very nervous and art handlers get very nervous when an artist has a work unframed, when an artist is very happy with having the work tacked to walls, or, you know, in your case, we used pins, we used magnets, you know, and condition checking your work is also, you know, a very exciting and unexpected process through the duration of a nearly 3-month exhibition. So it does make a difference to the viewer, though. And I think it really, again, brings out not just the feeling you just described of the delicacy and movement of the paper, but also really the texture and the materiality is very instructive and really allows the viewer to understand how it's made.
Yeah, thank you. And another, you know, something that was also unexpected for me was that these pieces keep evolving every time I show them. As you probably noticed throughout the exhibition, you know, they still shed a lot of debris of from the paper being drilled, and even the dust. I mean, even the original tar paper, the black tar paper that I was using, you know, that kind of adhere the drywall dust better. But every time I would show them, they would still lose a lot of dust. And even now, the black Canson paper that I'm using, even though it doesn't have that adhesion, it still preserves a lot of that dust. And moving them around, showing them, that piece keeps evolving and it keeps changing. And you know, that's something that I find both fascinating and enriching for my work, in the sense that, you know, I'm speaking about people who were taken out of this world in a violent way. And, you know, just like our bodies will decay over time, these pieces, in a sense, are kind of doing that. They're evolving over every time I show them. And I think that is, you know, a metaphor for what I'm trying to do with my work.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a couple questions about the photographs. One relating to a history of photography in Mexico. And the other is, again, about that more explicit layering of detail that Sonia referred to. And this person is contrasting them with your print. So thinking about that kind of very intense level of troubling, upsetting detail that we see in the photographs, and then your concurrent abstracting of that in the prints. So the viewer approaches the two different bodies of work from very different places.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the photographs, you know, as I mentioned, they were, as I keep repeating, I guess myself, is that, you know, they were seen as, for me, as they were going to be a starting point for something. I thought that I was going to make, you know, develop another technique that I would use then those photographs to, you know, to create something out of them. But eventually, as I said, the photographs themselves became the work itself, because they just capture exactly what I wanted to do in showing basically how people now have to live in the city. And I mean, every time I go back, I usually go back at least once a year to Juarez. And since those changes happen, I mean, they have stayed. The violence in city has, you know, it has waves. So 2008 to 2011, you know, that's when the city was at its most violent. And then after that, it kind of has shifted. You know, sometimes it has periods of not being violent as much, and then it kind of spikes up again. And so, you know, unfortunately, the citizens had to just adapt and live with these layers of security that they put them, you know, they created in their houses. So, you know, all those different layers, I see them in connection with the way that I work in my process. I mean, that is a process of, building the fence and then adding the razor wire and then adding an electric fence on top of that. And so I think that's why after looking at the images for so long, I just realized that the photographs themselves did exactly what I would have done, and they do it in a much better situation. As far as putting them in the history of photography with Mexico, I have to be honest. I'm not really versed with the history of photography just in general. I know of some wonderful Mexican photographers throughout history, and I cannot put myself in their position or even within that circle, because I don't think I know enough, and I'm still developing my work in that sense. Yeah.
So Miguel, I think we are nearing time. And so what I'm going to try to do is combine a couple final questions that have come in, as well as a thought or a question that I had wanted to share, having grown to know your work well over the last few months. And so I guess the crux of my question that relates to one coming from Hannah is, your work is clearly socially and politically motivated, right? And so, your work is taking on these issues, translating them into art, putting them out into the public, and allowing them to understand these issues like the war on drugs in Mexico in deeper ways. And so, could you just talk about your, positionality in terms of the social and the political? I mean, clearly now we're in a very, intense moment of, the global pandemic, Black Lives Matter movement, and artists are very much vocal on these issues. And so I think that would be really interesting to hear from you. And if you could perhaps also touch upon how you'd love the viewer to understand your work. So your positionality, what is your positionality in terms of these social political movements, but also how you would love the viewer to engage with them through your work. And that question hopefully addresses one coming from Jay Judge about what the viewer kind of sees or doesn't see through your work. Thank you, Miguel.
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't start it initially thinking that I was going to be a social activist or social artist in that particular sense. I mean, I've been doing this body of work for so long because it's something that, literally hits home. It's a place that I grew up and I saw it change because of this violence. And it was something that I just needed to talk about. There was, I tried different things, and it was always in the back of my mind, having this subject matter. And eventually I just had to basically cave in and decided that this is what I need to do. This is what I have to make my voice, artistic voice about. I am hopeful though that, my work is being understood by viewers everywhere around the world, and that hopefully it will make them, learn more about the situation with the drug wars in Mexico, or even prohibition of, narcotics and things like that, and how it affects, not just economics, but really people, and how this is a social issue. And hopefully also that would encourage them to make actions into even if it's as simple as signing going to protests or signing petitions or things like that. I feel that through the individual we can probably get to the universal. At least that's my feeling, and this is what I'm trying to do with my own work. I still don't consider myself as an art activist or activist artist, because I don't think that I'm doing enough. I definitely could be doing a lot more, and it's just, I think that will naturally happen, if it's going to happen. I've seen the evolution of other artists where they also didn't start it as activists, and then have become more active. And I am really hopeful for what's happening currently in the world. I mean, it's unfortunately we have to get to this bad state that we are. I'm talking specifically here in the US, but it has sparked the imagination of not only artists but just people in general. And we're finally banding together and doing something about it, and I think that's great. And some people are doing a lot more than me or than others, and I think collectively we can do something together. So that's what I'm hoping that my viewers will read into my work as well. Mine's specific to this idea of the drug wars in Mexico, but I think this is a problem that, you know, it's universal. It can be transferred to just about any other country.
Very inspiring.
That's a great observation, Miguel. I think that's a wonderful place for us to end as we ponder the impact of a lot of the social activist work that we see around us, and it becomes more and more relevant in our times. And we're so grateful that you were here with us tonight to share your thoughts and your practice addressing one of the more egregious ongoing issues of violence that doesn't get enough attention. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was delightful. Please visit Miguel's website to learn more, aragonmiguel.com. His work is available through Flatbed Press. You saw the images of his editions he's made there, and through the Print Center's gallery store. He made an edition for you as well. Is that correct? For the Print Center?
It's an edition available through the Print Center.
Yes, and also through his own website through direct contact. The Print Center's website also has more information and images from Aragon's recent exhibition, including curatorial notes written by Dr. Naril. And Manhattan Graphic Center will continue to deliver these online programs until we can safely hold them in person in our site and maybe beyond, because it is wonderful. We have so many participants here and from all over the world and the country. So thank you for being with us tonight, and look for future events on our website. I will turn this over now to Elizabeth to say her last words, and thank you very much.
And my last words are just to thank you, Sarah, and Manhattan Graphics Center for partnering with us tonight. Thank you to Miguel for a really informative and compelling talk, which you never disappoint. And just a shout out that Miguel won his solo exhibition from our 94th annual, and our 95th annual is about to close, deadline June 30th, with jurors Larissa Goldston of ULAE and David Campany of ICP. So don't miss your chance. Thank you so much to everyone who attended tonight.